What's up guys, Agent here again with another build video. Today we're going to be going over the Magicka Sorcerer. Specifically, this is going to be a pet build. I am experimenting a little bit with sound a little bit because I did listen to a couple of videos that I recorded a few days ago, and it does seem like the mic is a little bit weird, so I'm trying out the laptop's built-in mic now, and maybe that'll work better, maybe it won't. So we'll find out, and I'll take a listen at the next few videos to see whether I should just go back to using the mic or if I can just use the laptop's mic that's right next to the webcam. So that's why this video might sound a little bit different from the previous ones. So Magicka Sorcerer's pet builds are still actually still pulling lower than non-pet builds right now, at least if you're using a spammable type build like Elemental Weapon. This has kind of been a shift, and it's kind of been a trend that's been going on with each iterative patch. Non-pet builds have basically kind of been pulling close to, and now they're beating out pet builds now, which is kind of nice. Pet builds, they do give you a little bit more kind of AoE damage with the pet abilities, but at the same time, pets do have a bit of weaknesses, especially in certain trials, because they can sometimes die to mechanics. They might actually cause certain mechanics that act a little bit differently, which ends up, hurting your team more than benefiting your team. So pet builds now are not quite as popular as they used to be for Magicka Sorcerers. A lot of Magicka Sorcerers are running non-pet builds. That being said, though, pet builds are still usually pretty good overall. This particular pet build is going to be a spammable type build, so it's not going to be a heavy attack build. That's going to be coming in a later video. So just like the rest of our build videos, we'll be going over gear, skills, CP points, we'll go over our rotation, we'll do a 6-minute dummy parse so you guys can get an idea of where the Magicka Sorcerer stands in comparison to other classes. And we'll just talk about everything you need to know to kind of make this build your own. Now I do want to mention here that this build is kind of optimized around a very strong raid group. So you have Alkosh, you have Crusher uptimes going on. You have a Stampler or your healers running minor breach poisons. So that's something that you do have to keep in mind when we go through the parse and we go through the video and everything like that, the build itself. This is, again, optimized for a experienced raid group. If you're just in a progression raid group, you might need to shift a couple things around, and I'll be talking about all sort of substitutions that you might want to make to this particular build as we go over the relevant parts. So starting things off here, we're going to be starting off with gear. So this is one of the first things I do want to mention. We are using Zaan. This does assume we're going to be within melee range so we can get the most use out of Zaan. Zaan is still the strongest Magicka DPS monster health in the game right now. Of course, the downside is you have to be within melee range. And we are using heavy medium, and we do have a health enchant on a large piece. Doesn't have to be the head. I have it on the head here just because heavy with health, it just kind of makes sense in my head to kind of pair them together, but you can put the health enchant on your chest or legs as long as it's a large piece, and that's just because we are using Wicked Mother's Potent Brew, so we do want to have a little bit of extra health. Now, you don't necessarily need to use the health enchant, because as a pet build, you do get some additional health when you have your pet out, but I just like to have that additional padding there just to help my own survivability. So if you do need to play at range, because Magicka are one of the classes that do sometimes play, at range, you will be replacing Zaan, obviously, with either Ilambris or Skoria. So Ilambris is going to be more useful for bosses that are stationary because the prop doesn't move with the boss, and it will do a little bit more damage overall compared to Skoria. Skoria has a one-piece health enchant. Let me see if I can find it here. I see. The health has a health set bonus, so you don't have to use the health enchant anymore. You can just go with all Magicka enchants, and it does deal a little bit less damage overall compared to Ilambris on stationary bosses, but it does outperform Ilambris on very mobile bosses or bosses that teleport around. So classic example of this would be Asylum against both Felms and Lothus. They tend to teleport around. Skoria does all of its damage in one hit versus Ilambris, where the proc goes off and you have to basically get all the hits off in order to maximize your DPS potential. So Skoria is a little bit stronger. So you do want to have Skoria and Ilambris both sets available to you so you can swap out as the situation affords to. Now for our body set, we are going with Siroria. Siroria is perfect, I should say. You can go with the imperfect version. You just lose that additional max Magicka bonus on the 5-piece. So we are using Siroria instead of Necropotence, and I did test both Siroria and Necropotence out in the body, and it does seem like Siroria wins out as long as you're able to maintain those those stacks. If you're not able to maintain very good stacks, like you're moving around too much, then in that case you do want to swap over to Necropotence instead. The DPS difference, and I'll release a video on this once all these build videos are kind of completed. I'll release a video kind of showing you guys the difference between Siroria and Necropotence, both in a stationary fight where you're not moving around a lot so you can get those high stacks, and a very mobile fight where you're going to be moving around a lot so you won't be able to get those stacks. But generally speaking, if you're able to maintain those stacks, Sirorias will beat out Necropotence. Otherwise, you will want to swap over Necropotence. Now, I do have Divines on all of my pieces here. Now, technically, Infused is mathematically superior to Divines on your large piece if they have a Max Magicka enchant. But the difference is pretty small. When I did the math, it was probably around like 0.1%, 0.2%, so it is mathematically stronger. But to me, it's not really worth swapping over to Infused large pieces. You might as well just go with all Divines. Now for our second piece, we are going with Burning Spellweave because we are using 2 Inferno staves, so one on the front, one on the back. So we do happen to have pretty decent uptime with Burning Spellweave. So this will be on our jewelry and our front bar. So you can also use other sets if you don't want to use Burning Spellweave. You can go with Julianos if you'd like. That's a pretty easy set to obtain. You can go with Mother Sorrow. So those are kind of two options, other options that you can potentially run instead of Burning Spellweave. We are still going with 1 Magicka regen and 2 spell damage. Again, this is not a heavy attack build. This is a spammable build, so we do need that additional regen. Hence why we have Magicka regen left there. So I have 1 Bloodthirsty and 2 Arcanes as my jewelry traits. But you can go with 3 Bloodthirsty if you'd like, or with 3 Arcane, or any combination thereof. Generally speaking, 3 Bloodthirsty is going to be the strongest combination, but the DPS difference between any of the combinations between Bloodthirsty and Arcane, they're generally on, within 1% or so, 1k DPS or so. So it's not going to make or break you that way. Now for our front bar, we are still going with Infused on both of our weapons here. So Infused Burning Spellweave Inferno and Infused Maelstrom Inferno. For our front bar enchant, we're going with Absorb Magicka, again, just to help out with our sustain. You don't necessarily need to run Absorb Magicka if you don't want to. If you feel like your sustain is great, with orbs and worm and whatever, then you don't have to run Absorb Magicka enchants. In that case, you can run something like Weapon Damage enchant instead, or a Shock Damage enchant. And then on our back bar, the Maelstrom Inferno staff, we are going with a Flame Damage enchant, particularly because we are running Burning Spellweave, so we do want the Flame Damage enchant continually proccing so we can get more burning to help us maintain Burning Spellweave uptime. So you still want to maintain that Flame Damage enchant on the back bar, and it will be infused. So they did change how enchants work, so Blockade on your back bar will proc the Flame Damage enchant on your back bar rather than your front bar enchant, and it will remember if it's infused or not, so we are sticking with Infused Inferno staff on the back bar here. I think that's pretty much it in terms of gear substitutions. Now, one thing I might try out at some point is going to be Necropotence as a front bar set, but I'm not 100% sure if that would beat out Burning Spellweave or Mother Sorrow. So I've tested Burning Spellweave and Mother Sorrow out, and they both pull pretty neck and neck. It's going to be a little bit variable just because of RNG on the crits on Mother Sorrow side, and then Burning Spellweave uptime on the Burning Spellweave side, but they're both pretty comparable. Burning Spellweave on average pulls just a little bit ahead, so that's why I have Burning Spellweave up on here. Now we're going to go over our character sheet. So this is just kind of basic build information, race, things like that. So I am a Breton, but you can go with any of the other races. This is just because I tend to model my PTS characters after my live characters. So I am a Breton on live. So you can go with Dark Elves, the Dunmer. They're going to be strongest if you are going to be running 2 Inferno staffs like I have here, just because they get a little bit more flame damage out from their racial passives compared to High Elves. High Elves, the Altmer, are a good choice. They have a 9% additional Magicka regen, which is going to end up being very useful as a sword in order to help you out your sustain. They also get a little bit more Max Magicka compared to Dark Elves. They get 10% versus Dark Elves 9%, but they do lose flame damage, so they get 4% to flame versus 7% for Dunmer. Dunmers do get 2% shock and frost versus the High Elves 4% frost and shock though, so it balances out a little bit. They're both very, very good options. Bretons are also a decent option here. They do have 3% reduction to Magicka cost, which does help sustain, but it's not obviously as strong as Magicka regen. Then they do have 10% max Magicka there too. And another bonus is they do have very good spell resistance. They get almost 4,000 additional spell resistance, which does help out your survivability by a fair amount. So that's you're looking at about an additional 6% or so mitigation. So that will end up actually being quite useful in certain trials. Now, in terms of attributes, we're going with all Magicka, just because we have enough health as is. With we have about 16.4, 16.3k health, which is usually enough, especially when you consider when we have our pet out, it actually jumps up to 17k. So we don't actually need to put any points into health here. But if you want to, of course, you can put points into health. My personal recommendation would not to be to put no less than, or I should say, no more than 10 points into health, just because at that point you're giving up a little bit too much DPS just in exchange for survivability. So kind of have to balance that out a little bit there. Now for Moonstone, we are going with the Thief. You can go with the Apprentice instead if you'd like. Mathematically, they're both very, they're pretty much equal to each other. So you can go with the Thief or the Apprentice. It's kind of up to you how you want to, which Mundus you want to choose. Like I said, mathematically, they're both very similar to each other. And for food, well, much weather's Potent Brew, standard, what most Magicka DPS are running here just to help sustain. You can go with Clockwork Citrus Fillet, which is basically a slightly upgraded version of Witch Mother's, but because that is created using Perfect Draw, it is a little bit expensive. It's about 2k or so per food item, so you don't feel like you have to run it. You can just run Witch Mother's Potent Brew instead. And then, of course, for potions, we are running Essence of Spell Power, so this is our Major Sorcery, Major Prophecy, as well as Major Intellect, and then, of course, the Magicka that we gained back from using it. Now for our skills, start off here with our front bar. So this is a spammable build, where this is not a heavy attack build. So we have Crystal Frags, Elemental Weapon. Then we have our pet, Endless Fury. You can go with the other morph, which I believe is Mage's Wrath. It's up to you which one you want to use. Endless Fury is going to be a little bit more useful just because if you're using like in Trash Bowls, you'll be able to get some Magicka back. So it's a little bit more useful that way compared to Mage's Wrath, which is basically a little bit more splash damage. Daedric Prey, just to help boost our pet damage. Now you can go with the other morph, which is Haunting Curse, which will help out your sustain, just because with Daedric Prey you have to recast it every 6 seconds. Haunting Curse you have to recast every 11 seconds. So you do end up saving more Magicka if you're running Haunting Curse, but you do lose just a little bit of DPS. So it's kind of up to you which one you want to run. Now do keep in mind that non-pet builds will run Haunting Curse and not Daedric Prey. So you might want to just eat the DPS loss on your pet build and run Haunting Curse instead of Daedric Prey. So that way you don't have to swap back and forth between morphs. Then we have a Destro Oath, that's just to make sure we have our Ancient Knowledge passive going on. Sometimes you will be using this as your primary damage oath. It all depends on a specific fight. So with fights where you need the additional cleave damage, then you will use the Destro Oath. But otherwise you will be using your other oath on your back bar, Greater Stroke Atronach, for that single target damage instead. We have Elemental Drain here. This is normally where we put our shield, so you can go with Empowered or Hardened Ward. It doesn't really matter which one you choose. I prefer Empowered just because you get that additional Minor Intellect, which helps out your sustain. And it doesn't just help out you, it also helps out everybody around you, so they get Minor Intellect as well. So Empowered Ward is going to be, in my opinion, a better choice to make here. And we have Liquid Lightning. The pet, again, we do need double bar, so that way it remains active on both bars. Blockade, and then we have Rearming Trap here. You can go with the Sigil Order's Channel Acceleration if you'd like, particularly if you're running range, because obviously you won't be able to run to melee range to use Rearming Trap, so in that instance you pretty much have to use Channel Acceleration. So this is mainly here for the Minor Force. So if you can, stick with Rearming Trap because that uses your secondary resource instead of your primary resource. So it just helps out your sustain because you're using stamina rather than Magicka in order to gain Minor Force. It's not that big of a cost, so you can see your channel acceleration is only slightly above 2k, so it's not that big of a deal, not that big of a hit to sustain, especially because you're only recasting it maybe every 34-35 seconds, but it's better to use stamina rather than Magicka if you can help it. Then of course, Greater Storm Atronach for the single target DPS. Now it does give a synergy out, which will provide Major Preserve to whoever activates the synergy, so you don't obviously want to throw this on the opposite side of the boss. You kind of want to throw it close to group, but not necessarily between the group and the boss, because when the Storm Atronach eventually has to despawn, when it despawns, it actually acts as a entity, so you can't actually DPS the boss if the Storm Atronach is between you and the boss. So you kind of want to throw it off to your side, so close enough so your teammates can grab the Major Preserve synergy, but not so close that they can't DPS as it's despawning. Alright, now let's talk about our champion points. So the CP cap is 780, which gives us 260 points across each of the 3 different constellation types. Starting off with our green CPs with the Lover, nothing's changed too much, so 75 Arcane, 75 Tenacity, and that leaves 110 points you can put wherever you'd like, really. So I personally have 40 Shadow Ward, 40 Tumbling, and then 30 Warlord. Again, kind of up to you where you want to put those points. Now for our blue CPs, again, I do want to reiterate, this is optimized around having Elkosh and Infused Crusher in the group, as well as Minor Breach. So depending on your specific trials group, which debuffs you're able to run, you might have different CP setup because you might have more points into spell erosion compared to what I have here. So that's something you want to take into consideration here. So if you do need to put more points into spell erosion, I have a couple of points into staff expert that you can put into spell erosion. You can also drop Master at Arms and Elfborn here down to 61 each, which gives you another 10 points. So that's kind of how you can distribute points out that way. So I have 66 Elfborn, 64 Elemental Expert, 17 Spell Erosion, 3 into Staff Expert, 66 into Master at Arms, and 44 into Thaumaturge. Now you might want to shift a couple more points into Thaumaturge instead of Master at Arms or Elfborn. It really kind of depends on your specific build, like your very specific build. For a pet, so I am running a spammable build, so we don't have as many points into Thaumaturge. But when I do my pet build that's a heavy attack build, you'll find that we do have to shift some points around. So if you have a pet build that is a heavy attack build, obviously this is going to change. But your non-pet, there's not really a decent pet, a non-pet heavy attack build. So it's, in my opinion, it's better off just to continue to run the CP if you are going to be running a non-pet spammable build or a pet heavy attack build, because when you swap to your non-pet build, that's inevitably going to be a spammable build. Finally, for our red CPs, this is kind of a balanced approach, so we have decent mitigation for all the trials in the game, but it's not the best mitigation for each trial in the game. So if you want to optimize your mitigation, then you will need to shift some points around. We have 66 into Ironclad, 56 into Thick Skin, and 64 into Hardy and Elemental Defender. And the remaining 10 points are going to be put into Bastion, so we get that guild position passive, so we get some damage reduction while resurrecting another player. If you're in a guild that's really keen on doing no death runs, obviously you're not going to pick this node up. But if you're in a progression style guild, then it is a good idea to pick up guild position for that additional damage mitigation while you are resurrecting your friends. Alright, so let's go ahead and start talking about our rotation. The first thing, and I think I mentioned this every single time I make a Sorc video, so it's probably common knowledge at this point, but you do want to use Liquid Lightning before Blockade, and that's just because of the duration of each dot. So Liquid Lightning has a 10-second duration, Blockade has an 8-second duration. So if you run Blockade and then Liquid Lightning, you'll find that there's about a 3-second disparity here between when Blockade ends and when Liquid Lightning ends. So obviously that results in, if you do Blockade and Liquid Lightning, when you have to recast Blockade when it's up, naturally you're going to also want to recast Liquid Lightning. So that will usually end up with you overcasting Liquid Lightning, which isn't necessarily a bad thing because you're still able to get the ticks off as they go on, but it is going to end up being a little bit of harder hit to your sustain because you're not letting the dot run its full duration. It's not necessarily going to be DPS loss depending on how well you're sustaining, but it does introduce that additional, your sustain is not going to be quite as good. So you do want to do Liquid Lightning and then Blockade that way. Now there are a couple of builds out there. Royo is a very good example. Royo is an endgame player who's very, very good max Sorc, who runs Lightning Flood and Unstable Blockade. Those actually have I think the same duration. So I think Lightning Flood has a 6-second duration and Unstable Blockade also has a 6-second duration. So in that case, it doesn't matter which one you put down first. But if you are going with the more traditional Liquid Lightning, Blockade, Elemental Blockade, then you do want to do Liquid Lightning and then Blockade. Then your pet and your, I don't know why that happened, but your pet and then you have your Daedric Prey. So your pet Pulse has an 8-second duration. Your Daedric Prey, on the other hand, has a 6-second duration. So if you cast Daedric Prey first and then you use your Pet Pulse, you're going to be losing a second on that Daedric Prey. So you are going to be losing some additional damage. So generally speaking, you do want to activate your Pet Pulse first, and then Daedric Prey for the same kind of principle. You want all 6 seconds while Daedric Prey is active, because that gets you the additional pet damage. So if you do Daedric Prey and then the Familiar Pulse, you actually lose out on a second and a half, 2 seconds of that additional damage. So you just want to kind of address that before you, do your rotation. And then one thing I do want to mention, and I'll talk about this when we do the 6-minute dummy parts, and you guys will be able to see it, is you do want to maintain Crystal Frag procs going, because you do get Minor Prophecy when you use Crystal Frags. It is from Exploitation, so you do get additional 3% spell crit when you use it every 20 seconds. So you don't have to use it every time a procs and execute, you just need to make sure to use it every 2 blockades or something, so that way you're able to maintain that Minor Prophecy buff. So your rotation will look something like this. I'm not going to summon my pet just because then it'll mess up the 6-month dummy parse. But generally speaking, you do Liquid Lightning and then block 8, and then you put down Trap. And then you do Pet Pulse. I like to do Pet Pulse on the Spambo bar because that just gives you an extra opportunity to proc Crystal Frags. So you do like Pet Pulse and then Daedric Prey. And you'll see it when we do on a 6-month dummy. So again, I like to activate Pet Pulse while I'm on my front bar because that is another chance to get a Crystal Frag procs, and you do want to get as many procs out as you can. Now, one thing I do want to mention here is that when you do get a Crystal Frag procs, you want to use it pretty much as soon as you get it. That's just because if you sit on it and you just keep using a spam bowl or something, if you get a second proc, it'll actually override your first one. So you basically, in essence, wasted that Crystal Frag procs, the first Crystal Frag procs. So you want to make sure to get it off right when it happens. Now, sometimes you get a Crystal Frag proc right when you need to bar swap to reapply your dots. In that case, you really have 2 options. You either use it and then go back to your back bar and apply your dots again, or you can just apply your dots and then use your Crystal Frag proc right when you return to your front bar. With the changes with how enchants work, I think it's going to be better for you to put down your dots and then use Crystal Frag proc right when you swap to your front bar again. That's just because you do want to have block 8 up at all times, so that way you're basically being able to proc your flame damage enchant on cooldown that way. Alright, so that's kind of how the rotation is going to go. It's going to make a lot more sense when I do the parse here. Oops. We're just going to summon our pet here. So like I said earlier, depending on whether you need the additional cleave damage or you have a single target situation, you're going to swap your ultimates depending on the situation. So if you need cleave, you do the Vesture ult. If you need single target, you do the Storm Aggro. Generally speaking, you'll default to the Storm Aggro just because of the Minor Berserk synergy. But again, if you do need cleave, run the Vesture ult. So for this particular parse, we're running just the Storm Aggro the entire time. So here we go. We're going to go ahead and start our 6-month dummy parse so you guys can get an idea of the kind of DPS you can expect to pull with this build. And again, you want to do pet. Oh. You want to do pet and then Daedric Prey. So pet, then you have Frag Rock, Prey. So this rotation is pretty much a stat rotation. Now, if you are running Child Acceleration, obviously you're just going to cast it whenever it's up. It does have a cast time associated with it, so you don't want to use it when it expires. You want to use it when there's about 2 seconds left. see here, if you want to compare like sustain to the non-pet build, this is clearly much worse, just because again you have to recast Daedric Prey essentially twice as often. Now in Execute, you can maintain your pet pulse if you'd like. I personally tend to drop it, but you will definitely drop Daedric Prey or Haunting Curse, whichever one you end up choosing to use. So there we go, that is our parse here. So I am going to desummon the pet because I do have my second trap up, so if I don't summon it, it'll pull us into combat again. Or rather, it'll pull us into combat and will keep us in combat. So this is what we managed to pull, 42.2k. So if you want to compare that to the non-pet build, they're very, very similar in DPS. So that's non-pet builds and pet builds. The parity between them has pretty much been leveled out. So they pull very similar DPS to each other. Non-pet builds usually will pull just a little bit higher in raids than pet builds, without the disadvantage of having the pet. So a lot of sorts now are moving to non-pet builds compared to pet builds. So you can see here, light attack weaving, again, very, very important, especially since they buffed light attack damage in Somerset. And we have Liquid Lightning, Block 8, so these are going to be your strongest dots. You always want to maintain them down there. Block 8 in particular because you do want to keep your fiery flame damage enchant going, because that's what's going to proc it on your back bar here. Your Atronach, again, if you're just looking for pure single target, Atronach is a very strong, very, very strong ultimate to use here, and it's much better than Shooting Star. It also provides extra synergy, so when someone uses synergy, they get your Atronach also gets Major Berserk as well for 8 seconds, so that just helps out that damage there. You can see here, so for those of you guys who are wondering, because I know I'm going to have comments about this, why am I using Siroria rather than Necropotence? It's a pet build, you know, spell damage doesn't affect pet damage. And you guys are all correct. Spell damage does not affect pet damage at all. Well, it does, but it's very, very, very small coefficient. But here's the reason why. So the Atronach as an ultimate scales off of spell damage, not max Magicka. So the Atronach zap here actually benefits from running Siroria. Familiar Pulse is pet damage. This is affected by max Magicka, but it only makes up about 6% of our DPS. And then if we take a look at the standard attack that it does, you know, the rah zap move, it's another 1%. So right now we're sitting at about the 6% or so, or I should say 7% or so. So you know, you're talking about 7% of your DPS is affected by max Magicka, but the other 93% of your DPS, excluding Zaan. So if we get rid of Zaan, then it's actually closer to about 87% of our DPS is not affected by, or rather it's not necessarily not affected by max Magicka, but it's affected more strongly by spell damage than it is max Magicka. So in this situation, Siroria, while it doesn't seem intuitive, it is better overall for even a pet build, just because, again, pets don't make up a huge amount of damage, and Atros don't count as pets. Well, they count as pets, but they don't scale off of pets because it's considered an ultimate ability, so it'll scale off your max spell damage rather than your max Magicka. So I know everyone's going to be down in the comment section below telling me I should be running Necropotence, and in some situations, yes, you should be running Necropotence. When you can't get the Siroria stacks, by all means run Necropotence, but in fights where you can maintain the Siroria stacks, Siroria is going to beat out Necropotence every single time. So if you can maintain good Siroria stacks, something like 10 or up, you run Siroria instead of Necropotence. Because again, not a lot of your damage is actually pet damage. Everyone seems to think pets do a crap ton of damage, but you can see here in the parse, it's only about 7% of our damage overall. So hopefully that'll clear things up as to why I'm using Siroria rather than Necropotence. So that's it for this build video. If you guys have any questions or comments about the build, including why I'm running Siroria instead of Necropotence, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability, and if not, I'll try to find somebody who can give me an answer so I can relay that back to you guys. So that's it for this video. Hope you guys found this informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.